everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our Ruth online Bible study as we go through the book of Ruth and figure out how that relates to our lives and to God's will for each of us and our world. This week we are diving right into Ruth Chapter 1. I hope you've spent some time playing around with the introductory material and figuring out how this system works, as well as introducing yourself to the book of Ruth itself. One of my favorite things about the book of Ruth is kind of this juxtaposition of the realities of human life versus the type of things that God redeems and uses for God's work in the world. So, if you recall, as this story begins, we're kind of stuck in the midst of all the evil that can happen and all the hurt and harm and struggle that can happen to people, and yet God continues to work in redeeming ways, choosing loyalty and kindness as a part of the work. So remember, we were in the town of Bethlehem in Judah, watching Elimelech and his family leave for Moab. Their movement over to Moab was not something that God had instructed the people of Israel to do. It's something that was considered sinful and even inappropriate to pursue. So through that, the family feels like they've been cursed when Elimelech and then Mahlon and Chilion all die. Naomi and her daughters-in-law start off in Ruth chapter 1 weeping and sobbing and struggling and grieving. And as they start to make their way towards Judah, we find ourselves in verse 6 of Ruth chapter 1, hearing about what happens. Naomi first really just kind of grieves alongside the women. I imagine she'd be in quite a large amount of shock after they've dealt with these deaths back to back, and she's considering her options. Return home to her home of 10 years in Moab and really have no way of taking possession of the property or assets that they had, or return to Bethlehem, where she's been absent for 10 years. Return with 2 Moabite women in tow as evidence of her son's indiscretions according to the Israelite law at the time, and possibly the source of all of their deaths even. Now, while we know that we serve a redeeming God and that it's not about the people, at the time there were reasons to stay away from the Moabites, reasons that had been established through history, and that's how the Israelites practiced. And so Naomi is struggling with this fear of, did we do something wrong to cause these deaths? As we get started today, I really just want to ask, have you ever felt like Naomi? Have you felt like you've been doubting or struggling with, why did this happen? I mean, we've heard these things happen throughout the history of our Christian faith. A natural disaster comes and it must have wiped out that city because the people living in that city were sinful. Or a family finds that someone has committed suicide and, it must be because they never raised that person right. Or we hear accusations thrown out that because you chose this certain lifestyle, you're a horrible person and you deserve what's coming to you. But even though there is retribution for sin in our lives, God, first and foremost, seeks out redemption for us and ways that we can recover from the sin in our lives and restore our lives to the fullness and life abundance. So as Naomi's wrestling with these doubts and what she considers to be this judgment and this fear of returning home with embarrassing examples of her sin and all of her failures, and even just, feeling like she's going to return home to nothing, because she really is returning home to nothing. That's when she begins to discuss this with her daughters-in-laws. They're crying together, struggling together, kind of making their way down the road, when Naomi looks at them and says, go home. Go back to your mothers. Thank you for taking care of me. Thank you for caring so much for the dead, for your husbands and mine. But it's time for you to go home. Go. Leave. and the women weep together. And Naomi finds that Orpah and Ruth are saying back to her, of course we're not leaving you. You know, they're shocked by this kind of response. And yet Naomi insists. So they weep and struggle, and Orpah turns around and goes home, which is really what anyone would do in this kind of situation. This is what happens in their families. If your spouse dies, you as the female would return home. You would go to live in your brother's house, possibly as a servant. You'd be there protected until someone else could be found to marry you off to. Orpah goes where she's supposed to go. When have you felt like Orpah? Called back home. I think that even though we don't hear from Orpah anymore, and her choice is the stable one that tends to be overlooked, that many of us are really called into this kind of relationship. You know, we're called back to where we came from. Maybe we left to pursue an education. Maybe we left to pursue a job, or to follow a spouse, or just simply for an adventure. But at some point we find ourselves called back where we came from. So how do you faithfully live into that calling? Ruth, on the other hand, watches Orpah go and then looks back at Naomi and says the familiar phrases that we've heard echoed in many of our churches, that where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And she even swears it unto death, that this is what she's choosing. Ruth, who doesn't know this God that Naomi serves very well. I mean, you know, I kind of wonder about that, because she's been living with Naomi for at least a couple of years to be married to her son. So she has to have some evidence of what it means to follow God. But Ruth has no real understanding deeply of this Lord of all the universe. And yet she chooses to go that way. She chooses what might be the adventurous path, but is also the really dangerous one. She chooses to be a foreigner in a strange land. She chooses to go without the protection of a husband or a father. She chooses to be God's servant in this manner. And yet it's a God she doesn't really know. When have you been like Ruth? Called into the unknown. Called into something that's bigger than the faith you actually possess. Called to follow somewhere that you don't know what's going on. You know, in some regards, I think of how my husband and I started our married life together. When we met, I had just finished my just started my search for seminaries, and told him, hey, I'm going to be a pastor. This is what I'm going to do, and next year I'm heading off to seminary, and pretty sure it's going to be several states away, and so just fair warning. And he goes, great, what an adventure. And so we decided to, later on that year, to go ahead and get married before we left for seminary. And he picked up his education and followed where my calling was to go, and we've both found some thriving calling in the midst of that. But where you go, I'll go is not something many of us choose to do willingly. And yet God echoes this calling to us. Where should you go? Naomi protests a bit, but sees that Ruth is determined, and so they decide to go down this road together. And when they get to Bethlehem in Judah, when they return to the house of bread with all their fruitfulness stripped away from them, the people there look at Naomi and say, is that really her? Is that Naomi? Naomi's so racked by bitterness and grief and doubt and struggle and 10 hard years of living as a foreigner in a foreign land that they barely recognize her. She's lost all of her joy, she's lost all of her strength, and she's lost all of her hope. When have you felt like Naomi? Exhausted from the struggles, fearful from the results, and just simply bitter. I mean, Naomi's so bitter at this point that she tells them to call her Mara, which means bitterness, because she can't bear to be called by her own name. When have you been Naomi? What griefs overwhelm you so much that you can't see your joy? You know, one of my favorite phrases that a Sunday school teacher of mine taught me years ago, when I was caught in the midst of some difficult situations and some people were speaking against the joys I was trying to find and really placing me in a tough situation. She said, "Do not let anything a human can do steal the joy that God gives you." Naomi is finding her human situation stealing away what should be joy in her life. Not happiness, not being well pleased with the circumstances, but just simply the joy that comes from knowing God. Naomi can't even find that. She's so bitter. She can't even find enough joy to rejoice in Ruth's conversion to following Yahweh, their God. She can't find joy in her return to the home she's been long absent from. Grief and bitterness has overwhelmed every bit of her being as she struggles through her recovery process. You know, as we hear about all these different people and their different reactions and get ready for the miracles that we're going to hear about as God aligns circumstances and redeems people, I really am struck by the fact that these aren't just heroes of the Bible like we would normally see them through our rose-colored glasses. These really are real people with real faults being used by God. They're people making decisions similar to some of our own. They're people who feel the same kind of doubts and abandonment and grief and struggle and fear and bravery and loyalty and courage and just any number of emotions. They're really people who God uses, despite their faults, to accomplish not just kingdom work, but the work of bringing us a Messiah. The faulty yet faithful are still named as saints, despite their other names. I hope you'll spend some time reading through this and answering some of the questions and sharing your responses in the comments below. Spend some time on the reading guide to help you process what you're learning and doing, and then join me in praying this week for all the ways that God is at work in us and in our world. Blessings to you.